Good morning, as I said. Before I start my talk, let me do something that I've been doing at a number of conferences recently. I don't like berating audiences, but I look out and see a sea of white gentlemen. Where are the people of color? Where are the women? This is a problem in... Yes, hello! This is a problem in our industry. I have no idea whether the attendance here is representative of the industry in Poland. It is, okay. In which case, the industry problem, rather than a conference problem. But let me just say, this is our problem to solve. It is not up to the women to make the tech industry more inclusive of them, okay? It's up to us. So do everything you can when you go back to work on Monday. Look at what your company has in terms of diversity policies. How are you trying to encourage people who are underrepresented in our industry? Are you helping to sponsor and support user groups? Do you have appropriate hiring practices? Do you have appropriate promotion practices, etc.? And in addition, in terms of the conference things, try to make this an inclusive and safe space for all. And if you see any behavior that makes you uncomfortable, please tell someone so it can be fixed. Right, rant over, but I do like doing a little bit of an advert for diversity. Right, I hit F5 instead of Shift F5. We're nearly there. Okay, so today I will be talking about C# and how it is open, evolving, and everywhere. Hopefully including some demos later on of C# 7, which is slightly unusual for a keynote to be sort of mostly talk and a little bit of code later on, but hopefully it'll be fun for everyone. Out of interest, just to check that my audience is appropriate, how many of you are C# developers? Okay, good. That's at least the vast majority. If you're not, then I apologize. Enjoy Twitter. So, sort of the first half of this talk is really going to be a love story. It's a romance between me and C#. Now, some bits are very specific to me, and I've included them for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because there are very few ways better of satisfying a speaker's ego than basically talking about yourself for a while to 900 people. Who doesn't like to hear the sound of their own voice talking about themselves? But there is more to it than that, I promise. It's important for you to think about your personal story with C#. And it's a relationship. And that sounds very soft and touchy-feely, and this is a programming language, right? How can you have a relationship with a programming language? Well, how many of you have a sticker on your laptop? Oh, okay, this is clearly a cultural thing. In the UK or the US, everyone's hand would be up. Okay? I have a Women's Equality Party sticker on my laptop. And previous laptops have had many more. We tend to have relationships with our machines, and if we can have a relationship with a machine, then surely we can have a relationship with a language as well. There are times when you're programming when it feels like you're fighting against C#. And that's a hint that, yeah, maybe you should change your design a bit. It may be a perfectly good design, but it doesn't fit in with the flow. Think of a language as a river, and when you're going with the flow of the language, all is well. If you try to fight upstream, you're going to have problems. So that's why I think it's important to think about a personal relationship with a language, and why I want to give my personal story. All of you will have different stories, and I'd encourage you to reflect in the coffee time after this session just on what your relationship's been. Maybe it's been a more hate than love relationship. Who knows? But have a think about it. It's important. So my relationship started back in about 2000. The first beta of C# came out, and with it came, I don't know whether it was a white paper or a draft sort of specification, and I read it, I was a Java developer, and it said, C# is the sort of fusion of the best bits of C++ and VB. There was notably no mention of Java there whatsoever, despite the very, very obvious similarities. So I was kind of interested. I was skeptical. I played a little. I was a bit dismissive on Java newsgroups, partly because this was from Microsoft. Okay, Microsoft was not a hip and cool kid. Microsoft was enterprise software. This is kind of dull. It's kind of impersonal. No one likes Microsoft. Big gorilla in the room. I think these were roughly the days of some of the browser lawsuits. Who knows? But I wasn't a big fan personally, and all of this is just my personal view. At the time, I was not a big fan of Microsoft, so I sort of dismissed it a bit. And then I started playing a bit more, and I wanted to find my first post on the C# newsgroup, but I wasn't able to find any archives of it back before about 2008. But I started hanging out on the C# and the Java newsgroup, started doing a bit of C# professionally, and sort of alternating between the two. And this feels quite nice. I can see that there are things that this does that Java just didn't get right. Okay, it's still a V1 language. There are some things rough around the edges. Okay. Shame it's Windows only, though. And still, shame it's Microsoft. And I have to say, my feelings, I'm just as prone to flattery as anyone else. My feelings towards Microsoft became significantly warmer after they made me an MVP in 2003. There's nothing like someone buttering you up to make you feel better about them. Let's go on to 2005. Okay, by now I started to know my stuff with C#. And I went to the one and only time I've been to the MVP Summit. I would love to go again. There are various legal reasons why I can't. And I remember on the flight over to the MVP Summit, I wrote my first blog posts. I was reading up about Link, and I started blogging about what I thought about that. And interestingly, I had something... extension methods and how they're discovered. It's kind of trivial, but I didn't like the way that you imported a whole namespace and any extension method within it was used. I wanted to write using static and then a class name and get extension methods just from that class. And so I blogged about that in 2005, and in 2015, the C# team made it so. So, a 10-year feature request workaround, timeline. It's not quite ideal, but I'm very glad that it's here now. And back in 2005, I met very briefly Anders Hellsberg. Yay! More importantly for me, ongoing, I met Mads Torgersen for the first time. Everyone's heard of Anders Hellsberg, yeah? Father of C#. Out of interest, how many of you have heard of Mads Torgersen? Okay. A smattering, not unheard of, but these days, and I don't know how things went in terms of timelines, but these days, Mads is really the owner of C#. He's the loving parent who is growing this child beautifully. He's also a super, super smart guy and incredibly nice as well. There seems to be something about Danish technical folk that they're incredibly nice and incredibly smart. And I've worked with Mads on a number of occasions and do now. But I first met him in some hallways at the MVP Summit. And this is part of my relationship with C#. 2007, I start writing C# in depth. The first edition, it was published in 2008. And we start having C#3 Link is sort of fully fledged. And it's amazing how, as soon as you start writing something, you learn an awful lot more. So imagine you're writing the biography of your best friend in the world. You think you know them pretty well, and then you really try to find out what makes them tick. And suddenly you see a few sides to them that you may not be as happy with. And at the same time, you also see some sides to them, some underlying motivations that you'd never thought of before. And you see why they're a particular way. And it's just the same when writing about a technical topic. You learn a lot more about the reasons behind things, and also you form more relationships. That's when I started getting to know Eric Lippert, who was my technical reviewer, and knows more about C# than I ever could. The comments that he wrote on C# in depth, I will always treasure. They were, every one of them was a pearl of wisdom, and I wish I could just include them all in the book. But in 2007, in November, Visual Studio 2008 came out. And by the time we've got C# 3, now C# have really raced ahead of Java. C# 2 had, better generics than Java, but there were a few other things that Java was ahead. By the time you've got C# 3, we have LINQ, we have anonymous types, we have Lambda expressions. It's really, I feel, transformative. This has gone from a language which is pretty like Java to, oh my word, I can accomplish so much in so few lines of code, and they're really readable afterwards. There are plenty of languages where you can do a lot in a short amount of code. The question is whether you can then understand the code when you come back to it later on. Perl, I'm thinking of you. It's funny how, I think Perl 6 is now out, isn't it? I should have a look. Maybe it's all entirely readable now. I've never personally got on with it massively. And then 2008 happened, and you may be wondering if, well, Visual Studio 2008 is already out in 2007 through interesting time dilation effects. But in 2008, two things happened. Personally, I joined Google, and Stack Overflow started. Out of interest, Stack Overflow users? Yeah. So much to learn, so much to write, so much fun to have, and a lot of it was with C#. Not all of it, I write plenty of Stack Overflow answers on Java and things, but okay. But at work, lots of fun, very little C#. Okay? C# in Google, circa 2008, not so much. Okay? There are still hard feelings about Microsoft, still not the cool kid, still thinking about enterprisey things. But I get some C# in there. We have these wonderful things at Google called 20% projects. You kind of work on not whatever you like, but something that's relevant to Google. And so I ported our internal serialization format, protocol buffers, protobufs. I ported that to C#. Great fun. I'm now going to start skipping ahead. So all the way to 2013. And I'm skipping 2010 and C# 4 because, yeah, I'm not so much of a fan of C# 4. I can see why they did dynamic typing. It's not my ball of wax. I'm a really die-hard statically typed fan. If you're finding dynamic useful, then that's fantastic. I think they did a really good job with it. It's just not a feature that I would have chosen to put in there. But oh, C# 5. Oh my word. I was at a conference in Oslo, 2010, I think, probably. And I gave a talk after, this was crazy, after Mads gave a talk about C# 4, I gave a talk called If I Ruled the World, C# 5 According to John. Okay? I do like these egocentric things. And there was Mads there was Eric Lippert was there, Neil Gafter was there, and Neil was taking notes on an iPad. It's like, no, don't listen to me. You have far smarter people designing your language. And the good news is they didn't listen to me, because all the things that I was talking about for C# 5 in my dream world were minor things. And we got async instead. And async has started spreading to other languages, other platforms. And I think it's reasonable to say that just like Lambda expressions, if you were to design a new language today, would any of you design it without Lambda expressions or something like them? No, they're just so clearly useful. They're clearly something that you want to have in your language. And I think the same is true with async. Now, F# fans amongst you may say, F# had async long before C#. It's like, yes, that's true. And in fact, Many of the new features of C Sharp are blatantly stolen from F Sharp and just tweaked to feel like C Sharp features, so that it always feels like the language that you've grown comfortable to and comfortable with. And that's absolutely fine. It brings a much broader appeal. Personally, I'm very happy for F Sharp to experiment and maybe make some mistakes and do things that maybe aren't as useful. And then C Sharp can just cherry pick the best bits of those and the bits that work best with the language. But I think it's hard to overstate how important I think C Sharp 5 is going to be in the future of programming languages in general. Okay, starting to slow down again. What happened in 2014? Well, Roslyn went open source. Okay, there may have been, trying to look at the history of all of these things, there may have been a few things before that that were important, but for me, this feels crucial. And as well as Roslyn going open source, .NET Core starts. How many of you use KVM? Not very many. I can't remember whether I did or not. I think I may have started with DNVM. So, only one iteration ago. But it's all open source. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. But this is huge. Okay? This is the company that was so enterprise-focused and closed and not the cool hip kid. And they're saying, do you know what? Here's a bunch of code. And not just here's a bunch of code that we don't care about anymore. Or here's a bunch of code and look, don't touch. But here's a bunch of code. Hack on it. If you have a language feature you would like to propose, then go for it. Why not try implementing it? Because, hey, you can. You've got the compiler. This is awesome. And at the same time, and this has been, we've been quiet about this. We haven't made a big fuss, but we are standardizing C Sharp 5 in ECMA. ECMA, International Standardization Body, and traditionally there has been the C Sharp language specification as put forward by Microsoft, and the C Sharp standard as standardized by ECMA. And they use a few different bits of terminology, finalizers versus destructors, and they have completely different numbering systems for the sections. So, if you're trying to keep the two in sync, it's a bit of a pain. ECMA standardization sort of stopped at C Sharp 2 until about 2014. Now there are a bunch of us working hard to standardize C Sharp 5. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, C Sharp 5 is like 2 years old already. What about C Sharp 6? We'll get there eventually, but we're going for C Sharp 5 first. And the hope, and this is only a hope at the moment, but fingers crossed, is that eventually there will be one document with one set of terminology and one set of numbering, and that a standard will come out. Microsoft will propose the next version of the standard as a draft, and we'll work through that and standardize it, and that's how the language evolution can go along. But it's all nice and open. It's all working with the community. It's all for the sake of all of you. And that's really where it feels like industry has changed. I'll talk more about that when I talk about the everywhere. So, I'm reading the C Sharp spec, filing loads of bugs. We have, I can't remember, 500, 600 issues logged in the ECMA standardization. It's amazing when you pick through things with a fine-tooth comb, you find all kinds of little problems. 2015, we get C Sharp 6. Out of interest, how many of you are using C Sharp 6 now and are sort of familiar with it? So that's, my guess is about half. I really encourage the rest of you to. Aside from anything else, it will make you feel smarter. Okay, that's a strange thing, but one of the features I love most about C Sharp 6 is expression body members, where you use something that looks like a Lambda expression for simple methods. And you can do that and feel, I'm an F Sharp developer, really. I'm a Haskell developer, really. I must be so smart. It's just a little bit of syntactic sugar. But it has this feeling of, I'm doing functional programming. So I'd strongly encourage you, if only for your ego's sake, to start using C Sharp 6. And if you do use C#6, you will be using Roslyn. There's no alternative because there's no C#6 compiler that is the old written in C++ compiler. You could be using the mono compiler, don't get me wrong. But you won't be using the old CSC. That's legacy now. Things have changed, the world has changed. If you think that there's something wrong with the compiler, you could, I'm not sure I recommend it, but you could go in and try to debug through and see at what point it's causing a problem. This is huge. I sometimes think that our industry doesn't quite realize how big a deal this is. A slightly strange question to ask what's for breakfast, and this may be a cultural thing again. Is Winnie the Pooh a thing in Poland? Yeah? Okay. So A.A. Milne wrote a delightful set of children's books. I once gave a talk at my college at university because that's where A.A. Milne studied. And at the end of one of the Winnie the Pooh books, right at the end, we have, "When you wake up in the morning, Pooh," said Piglet at last, "what's the first thing you say to yourself?" "What's for breakfast?" said Pooh. "What do you say, Piglet?" "I say, I wonder what's going to happen exciting today," said Piglet. Pooh nodded thoughtfully. "It's the same thing," he said. Beautiful words. So what's for breakfast? What is making me excited today? Well, we have a lovely language. I've described my relationship with this beautiful language. We have an open source compiler. We have an open source and cross-platform runtime with a not quite version 1 toolchain. And things are happening. And we have a not quite done C#7. So let's look at those again. We're starting to take it for granted, which is in some ways one of the greatest things. You know, if Microsoft today announced that they were delivering another open source project, whether it was a new project or they were opening up something that was previously closed source, would it make headline news? Even on Slashdot? Probably not. Because, hey, it's just another day of the week. We're so used now to Microsoft opening things up that that's just what happens. So we have the compiler, as I've said, and not just the C# compiler, but F# and VB. We have the runtime. We have toolchains, not just .NET CLI, but also PowerShell is open source and now in either alpha or beta running on Linux. Yay. We have MS Build, which is obviously going to be the core of the .NET project system moving forward. And we have a whole IDE in Visual Studio Code. We have all the libraries, whether they're part of the .NET framework itself or additional libraries. We have frameworks, the most obvious of which is ASP.NET Core, but it's certainly not limited to that. There's Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core, both open source. And if you're saying to yourself, yeah, but we've had open source stuff for .NET forever. I remember Rota. And if you remember Rota, it was the sort of a reference implementation of the CLI back in 2002 or something. And it was, I gather it worked. No one used it, as far as I know, maybe some folks in academia. But it wasn't what you were running on your machine. Whereas what we've got now, certainly if you're running .NET Core, and I don't have inside information about this, but my guess is that Microsoft doesn't like maintaining two very similar source code bases, so I suspect that the desktop CLR and the .NET Core CLR have an awful lot of code in common. And you can see it all. It's the actual code. And it's not just being developed by Microsoft. I'm really pleased. I had lunch with Martin Woodward on Tuesday. He's the director of the .NET Foundation, dedicated to basically helping open source projects within the .NET space. And he said that for non-Microsoft, contributing to the .NET space in general, I don't know how he measured it, Google is apparently the #1 contributor. Awesome. But it's far from just companies. Martin has a slide where he shows the number of pull requests from the community, and A, it's going up and to the right, sort of exponentially, and B, it's a really large number, in the hundreds of pull requests per month for core technology. This could not have happened a few years ago. It's real open source. And being real open source kind of forces it to be everywhere. I very much doubt that it would be popular open source if it were Windows only. So just 5 years ago, if I asked you where you were running .NET, not where you could run .NET, but where you actually were, we would hear about desktops for internal apps and Windows servers running ASP.NET. And that's kind of it. Now, okay, it's still somewhat theoretical in some cases, but my understanding is there's quite a lot of usage. I can run it here on my Android phone. I can run it on my iPad. And I need to get back into Xamarin stuff. I've been too busy to look at it for a while. But certainly I used to have a couple of test applications written in Xamarin to test that Node-a-Time, my personal date and time API, would work properly on both of those devices. So I had a little time zone drop down and it would tell you what the time was, or in the case of the iPad, I had a little world map and you could tap somewhere and it would say, oh yeah, I know what time it is there. That's pretty amazing. With Unity, it runs on goodness knows how many devices. People writing in C#. Okay, going through all manner of processes to get onto the device, but as far as the programmer is concerned, it's C#. And I don't know whether any of you have heard, but the beta of the next version of Unity is effectively like .NET 4.6, using a much later version of Mono than the very old one that they used to be using. And my guess is that they're working on .NET Core support. I have no particular contacts within Unity, but if they're not working on .NET Core, I'd be very surprised. So it runs on all those devices, and it runs here. This is my shed. So we built this about this time last year. I say we built it. I got other people to build it because otherwise it would have collapsed. I don't do this kind of thing. So over on the my little dot is so little you won't see. Over on the right-hand side, we have actual shed things. There's lawnmowers and stuff in there. Over on the left-hand side, that's my home office. And it's very nice and cozy. But there is a bit of a problem. So when I'm working from home, I try to keep to the same kind of schedule that I do when I'm working in the office, which means I get up at 6 o'clock. Or, if I'm working from home, maybe I'll snooze the alarm once or twice, so it may be 20 past 6. But generally, I'll be in the shed at least before 7 o'clock. Now, in some places giving this talk, they'd say, so what? My guess is you understand dark mornings, okay? Nowadays, in the UK, at 7 o'clock in the morning, it's pretty dark still. Now you can see this bit of garden, it's not actually the mud that it looks like. There are wood chips there, and this photo was taken back in December. It looks a bit nicer now with a bit more decking and things. But it's a bit annoying in the dark. So I really want to be able to turn the lights on in the shed before I go out there, so that I can see to put the key in the keyhole and things. And that's easy and doesn't require .NET at all. I got some Wi-Fi controlled lights. I turned them on with my phone from a custom app. Great. Sooner or later, I go in the shed, I start working, and eventually the sun comes up. And it does get nice and light in the shed. How do I turn the lights off? And this is one of those things where, as developers, and why this is a very personal story, as developers, we don't necessarily think of the long-term actual benefits, because I can easily use the same app from my phone. It would take me 15 seconds each time. But wouldn't it be more fun if I could turn them off from the laptop? Okay? And I can find an open source project that targets this particular brand of light. Hooray! So I can write a little .NET application, and I can type shed lights off. Yay. I then think, oh, well, if I'm going to control that from my laptop, what else could I control from my laptop? Well, I've got a Sonos in there, and I've got a speaker system with an amplifier. Now, obviously, there's the whole Sonos nice UI, but hey, wouldn't it be nice to just be able to say play or pause and just get it working? And turn the amplifier on and set it to the right source, so it's either coming from the PS4 or the computer or the Sonos or whatever. So that's great. I can do that as a command line app, and there is nothing new there. But what if instead of writing one command line app with all the code in there, say I split it, and I had a .NET Core assembly that contained all the code to actually do the gubbins, do all the networking, and the command line app is just a driver. Okay. I still only have a command line app. I could now write a WinForms app, should I wish to. I didn't bother doing that. I went straight to a Universal Windows app, doing speech recognition, because it's really easy to do. The code for it, it took me a while to find the code, but now I've got the code, there's not a lot of it. So now I can run it on my laptop and say, shed lights off, and the lights go off. Okay, this is still running a load of code on my laptop. But then I can take that exact same code, and I mean not changing a line, and I can deploy it to a Raspberry Pi 3 running Windows IoT. And that's what I've done. And I've got a wall-mounted Raspberry Pi in my shed with a tiny little microphone sticking out. You wouldn't believe how powerful it feels to stand up, pack up your laptop, say, shed lights off, and off you go. It's amazing, just the feeling, the raw power. I can turn lights off with the power of my voice. Is there anything I cannot do? Well, you need to kind of say, shed lights off, shed lights off, shed lights off, until it actually recognizes it. But when it works, it's fantastic. I haven't tried it, but I could take that same application and run it on a Windows phone, I believe with no changes. I haven't tried it, but I've got an Xbox One in the lounge, and I should be able to put that into developer mode and just install the app, and maybe I'd need to say Xbox shed lights off. That's pretty awesome. So that's kind of deploying everywhere. Now let's talk about everywhere, everywhere. That's all fun, but this really excites me. Can you run ASP.NET applications in Azure? Well, duh, of course you can. Can you run ASP.NET Core applications in Azure on Linux? Well, duh, that's the point of ASP.NET Core, that you can do that. Can you run ASP.NET applications on a Windows VM in Google Cloud Platform? Yes, you absolutely can. Can you run an ASP.NET Core application on App Engine flexible environment? Yes, you can. Now we're cooking. This is starting to sound really exciting. Can you run ASP.NET Core applications on Kubernetes, such as on Google Container Engine? Hell yeah. Beautifully orchestrated microservices, best of all worlds. When I joined Google, I had this dream of standing at a conference, and I would do some ASP.NET development. The one thing that was always a major problem for this is I'm not a web developer by any means. Look at the HTML on any website that I run, and you will run screaming. But I had this idea I would be writing some ASP.NET thing to demonstrate some interesting feature, and I would deploy it to Azure, and everyone would say, yeah, you've deployed it to Azure. And then I would flick a switch, and I would deploy it to App Engine, and everyone would go, wow, we didn't know that that could happen. I expected it would use mono. And in fact, I didn't really expect it to happen at all. Well, now you can just deploy any Linux Docker container to Kubernetes, Container Engine, App Engine Flex, and it just works. So of course it supports ASP.NET Core. Container Engine hasn't needed to change to enable that. It's just several companies, Docker as a company, and Google as a company, and Microsoft as a company, all doing stuff for you, and it all just works together. How many of you were in industry in, say, the year 2000? Okay, I feel old now, but that's fine. I can feel experienced. Let me just say, industry did not feel like that. The idea that significant competitors' products would just work together and everyone would be happy and everyone would start taking it for granted, that really didn't happen. And it's not just that it happens to work, but the companies get excited about this. Both Microsoft and Google are excited about this. So if any of you watch the ASP.NET community stand-up, just this week, Scott Hanselman highlighted a blog post by someone in my office back in London, Meta Atamel, about running ASP.NET Core in Kubernetes. And Scott Hanselman said, right, look, take a screenshot. This is awesome. This is amazing stuff. This is why we did it. And Chris Sells, who used to work at Microsoft, is now my product manager at Google, wrote a blog post in August that says, near the bottom, first and foremost, we are serious about supporting Windows and .NET workloads on Google Cloud Platform. Second, we're just getting started. And I just want to show you briefly, and this will require just switching presentation modes as well, so who knows what will happen. Right, let's have browser up. If I go to the Cloud Console in Google Cloud Platform, okay, out of interest, how many of you use GCP? Okay, I hope to change that. There's a little button up here saying Activate Google Cloud Shell. Now, changing the font size here could be tricky, so hopefully those of you at the front can be sufficiently excited for those of you near the back. So what's happening right now is, oh, it didn't take long enough for me to worry about it. It started up a VM and has started up a shell with a connection to the to that VM. And there's kind of nothing here. But I do have .NET CLI, just straight away. So let's just make a directory. Oh, sorry, my spacebar has become worryingly spongy this morning. And let's do .NET new -t web. And that will take a little while, because it's the first time that .NET's run on this VM. And while it does that, I will just launch the code editor, because the exact template .NET Core, ASP.NET Core web application doesn't quite work out of the box, because it tries to expose port 80. And the way that Cloud Shell works, you need to run on port 8080. Well, that's easy enough. All we need to do is change one file. Now, I could just use vi here, and I may do so if this doesn't respond fairly soon. Oh, it's coming. So we've got a VM here, and the VM's going to go away in about 20 minutes if I'm idle for 20 minutes. So I don't want it to cost me money. But your home directory, whatever you put in the home directory here, that will persist across VMs. So I could have done all of this back in the hotel, but I decided that I would just do everything as live as possible, because that's never gone wrong for anyone at a conference ever before. So it's just loading up the code editor. And again, this is because I haven't done this before on this VM, and I actually wiped my home directory so that it would all be the same experience that you'll get. As that's taking a while, which could be the Wi-Fi here, I'm just going to, I created a demo directory and didn't change into it. Never mind. I've splatted stuff all over my home directory. I'm just going to edit program.cs with vi, and all I need to do is type use URLs HTTP star 8080. Now work out how to save something in vi. I think that's right. .NET restore. That will then take a little while, because that's what I should have done while I was saying about everything else, because this is having to fetch all the NuGet packages. Meanwhile, we can see, yeah, okay, by now the editor has loaded, and we can see in here program.cs, and we should see the changes that I've just made. Yeah, so we could have edited it in a slightly nicer fashion. Right, so that's finished restoring. And I can now just run this on this VM, and when that's finished compiling, okay, I didn't make a typo, it really is called use URLs, hooray. Okay, it's running, and now I can just hit web preview. And anyone who's run ASP.NET Core, this will sort of be unimpressive in that it's something you've seen before. There we go. But you probably haven't seen it before starting on Google Cloud Platform on an ephemeral VM that I just started, and everything was there for me. I needed to add one line of code, and my guess is a future version may even default to using 8080. I think that's pretty cool. And the fact that Google was happy to put the .NET CLI into the Cloud Shell by default, it's not the only thing. You know, I think we've got all kinds of bits of, probably, we've got Ruby. That's taking a while, so probably Java. Yeah, I'm sure we've got Python, and all the other things that you would probably have expected, and .NET's there as well. Because these days, .NET is just another open source language, cross-platform, it can do everything kind of thing. Let's go back to the presentation. There we go. And I find that really exciting, and I'm thrilled that I don't work on that little bit of it, but I'm on the fairly small team within Google which is pushing for C# to be as useful as possible on GCP. Because why wouldn't we? So that was a lot about .NET Core, but this talk is entitled C#, Open, Evolving, Everywhere. So we now currently have C# 7 sort of, it's in the oven. It's not fully baked yet. There are a few features that I can't show you today that I know about. There are quite possibly a few features that I don't know about that are still yet to come. But just to give you a brief preview, so we have tuples and deconstruction of tuples and pattern matching. Those sort of go together as a bit of a lump. One of the difficult things, I'm currently writing the next version of C# in depth, next edition. And it's great for C# 3. I can say, this is all about link. C# 4, it's all about dynamic. You know, I don't like it, but it's all about dynamic. And C# 5, it's all about async. And C# 6 is kind of a bunch of useful things that make your code smaller. And C# 7 is a bunch of useful things, and there are sort of things about tuples and deconstruction that are kind of related. But it's much harder. There isn't one global unifying theme. But we do have all of these different features, and probably some more to come. So I probably shouldn't have bothered switching out, but let's go back into duplicate mode. How many of you have played with C# 7 already? Very few. OK, that's good to know. So I will try to keep it sort of assuming that you haven't seen much. This is Visual Studio 15 preview, not to be confused with Visual Studio 2015, which is out. I'm sure Microsoft will be glad when the years start going by faster than the releases so that things don't get so confusing. But my guess is that this will be called Visual Studio 2017, and that Visual Studio 16 will be in Visual Studio 2019 or something like that. So, one of the things that .NET has had for a while is tuples, but tuples are just a reference type and there's no language support until now. So this is actually not using the tuple type from the framework. This is using a new type called value tuple, new set of types. One of the things that isn't terribly obvious when you first start using Visual Studio 15 preview is you need to install a NuGet package. Let me show you which one it is in case you want to play along later on. So in my references, I have system.valuetuple. That, I'm sure, will be part of, who knows what version number will come out with Visual Studio 15. Will it be .NET 5? Will it be .NET 4.7? Will it be .NET 4.6.3? Who can tell? But I'm sure value tuple will be part of it. Value tuple just contains a bunch of structs. One struct with 2 fields, one struct with 3 fields, one struct with 4 fields, etc., etc. And these form tuples. So when I have this return type, that's saying, create me a tuple of int string and kind of hint that the names are X, Y, and Z. So one of the reasons you don't want to use tuples right now, and instead probably end up using anonymous types, is that system.tuple has item 1, item 2, item 3, etc., etc. And that's just awful for readability. It does mean, you can return them from methods and things, and that's good. Whereas if you return an anonymous type from a method, you can't really express in the language what that type is. So within a method, anonymous types are great. You get immutability, you get equality to string, hash code, and names, and it's all good. But you can't return them anywhere. You can return tuple of t, etc., but then you have item 1. With tuples in C#7, you kind of get the best of both worlds, but you need to understand them. So where anonymous types, the compiler generates a type so that it really does have, if I do var anon equals new, x equals 5, y equals 3, and z equals hello, that will have created, in fact, an instance of a constructed type. So this will generate a generic type within my assembly that's internal to the assembly that is generic in 3 type parameters but has properties called x, y, and z. So that's great in terms of those properties really do exist. Tuples don't work like that, partly because you want to be able to return them across assembly boundaries, and you also want to treat them sort of in a structured typing kind of way, but with the types rather than just the names. So if I hover over var here, this will be too small for Mini to see, it shows that it's a system int 32x, system int 32y, and system string z. And you can see I am referring to things by their actual names. I could also just do item 1. Okay, that will do exactly the same thing. And there is no IL representation of x, y, and z here. The compiler has said, do you know what? Something kind of gave me a hint that it wants to use names x, y, and z. I'll just do that. If I have another method, create 2, I can do A, B, C, and let's give them different values. 10, 6, world. Okay? I can do tuple equals create tuple2, and that will just work. But now we still use x, y, and z because the names are inferred when you first initialize the variable. Okay, so the names are hints more than really being part of the type. And if you do console.writeLine tuple, it can only tell you item 1, item 2, item 3. In fact, I think it just omits the names entirely because it doesn't know what x, y, and z are. They're compile time only things. If you're familiar with Java generics, Java loses the type information at execution time. C# tuples lose the name information. Okay? It's unfortunate, but better than nothing. We can also deconstruct tuples. So I mentioned that this is value tuple, and it is a struct. It's a value type. Let me scare you a little bit, or at least I was scared. Tuple.x equals 10. Wow, I'm mutating a value type. That may be scary. It's fairly important that the tuple type is regarded purely as a bag of variables. Just like an array is a bag of variables, that's what a tuple is. In particular, item 1, item 2, item 3 are not properties, because that would have some subtly different behavior. They are just fields. They're exposed public fields in a mutable value type, and just that combination of words scares the heck out of me, but I think it's the right decision. I'm really looking forward to explaining why it's the right decision in my book after telling everyone not to write mutable value types and not to expose fields for many years. But I think it does make sense. But if you've got a tuple, you can pass it around, you can take the individual values. But what if I know that I want the individual values and I don't want a whole variable for the tuple? Well, I can just do decomposition. So this is the same kind of code as we had before, but instead of saying var tuple equals create tuple, I'm just going to declare 3 variables. And if we hover over A, that's of type int, B is int, and C is string. All it's doing is saying, well, take that tuple and decompose it, deconstruct it into 3 different variables. That's great. What I really like about this feature is, as far as I'm aware, the C# compiler has done nothing special for tuples there. This is just one example of deconstruction. So if you have a type, in this case deconstructible, and it can have an x, whatever x is, and a message and an error, I can do exactly the same kind of things as I did before. So let's construct our deconstructible, and then I can deconstruct it into code and message. And here I've explicitly declared them just as part of a bigger demo. But if let's just kill that. I can do var code message equals that. I could also do because I've got another deconstructor taking an exception as well, I can do var message exception equals new deconstructible. And you specify some properties. So basically, any time that there's a special method called deconstruct that has to be accessible, returning void, and with just out parameters, at that point you can deconstruct things however you wish. And the one lovely thing is, they don't even need to be methods within that type. Extension methods work as well. Just for the sake of a bit of fun, I'm going to show you evil deconstruction. So, depending on whether you have a using static for evil extensions UK date format or evil extensions US date format, you can either write Well, you can write var xyz equals date, and depending on which one you've imported, either x is the month and y is the day, or x is the day and y is the month. I'm not suggesting that you should do this, but it's lots of fun. I will be including it in the Abusing C# talk tomorrow. We're running out of time, and I certainly don't want to deter you from coffee in a minute. But just to switch back briefly, that was a brief introduction to tuples and deconstruction. To my mind, those are... Oh, wow, I've lost everything now. No, revert, revert. I want to see what I'm doing. Extend, please. Okay. There we go. So, tuples, deconstruction, there's pattern matching that works with the deconstruction. Some of this is coming, everything listed here is coming in C#7, but there will be more in C#8. Around pattern matching specifically, there may or may not be non-nullable reference types. They'd hope to have those in C#7. There may or may not be record types. They'd hope to have those in C#6. One thing I love about our language design team is they are working hard to make sure they solve the problem correctly first time. Okay? We're all happy with semantic versioning, right? I can release 1.0, and yeah, that's kind of a big deal. The number 1.0 is my scariest number at the moment. But at least if things go wrong, I can release a 2.0 and make some breaking changes. Yeah, you just can't do that with languages. Certainly not languages that are relied on by enterprises. C# is no longer restricted to enterprises, but enterprises do rely on it. You don't want to say, do you know what? We messed up record types in C#7. We'll do them again in C#8 in a completely backwardly incompatible way. That's not going to happen. So if the C# team isn't happy with something, it will wait. This is a great thing. So hopefully that's given you a flavor of what I find to be exciting in the C# world today. There are always new things to play with, whether it's in the language, whether it's some new open source tool, whether it's some open source project that you can say to Microsoft, you know what, this would be so much better with feature X. Here, I've built it, why don't you take it? And it will go through rigorous code review, and Microsoft engineers will be supporting your code, as in telling other Microsoft customers how to work with your code and fixing any problems. That's a pretty awesome thing. You can do stuff anywhere, phones, HoloLens, sheds, servers in Azure, servers in AWS, servers in GCP. Wherever you think of running some C#, you can probably do it. There is nothing stopping you from building awesome things. So go and do it. Thank you.